A warm welcome to those attending and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. My name's Councillor Richard Lewis and I'm the chairman of this meeting. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and online under the live broadcast. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm goes off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please switch off your mobile devices to silent before the meeting starts. Please note that councillors on the committee may use their laptops or tablets during the meeting to view the agenda paperwork. Before we go into the agenda, I'd like to go around the room and ask officers and councillors to introduce themselves.
Anisha Tedji, Democratic Services.
Councillor Stuart Mathers.
Councillor Narinda Garg.
Councillor Gasharan Mand.
Matthew Kelly, Head of Procurement and Commissioning.
Marie Stokes, Head of Finance, Central Services and Finance.
Andy Goodwin, Interim Financial Planning Manager.
Councillor Hector Gohill, subbing for Councillor John Riley.
Councillor Kaushik Banerjee, Committee Member.
Councillor Kishan Bhatt.
Thank you. So, can we start with the agenda? And item 1 is apologies for absence, so we have Councillor Riley.
Thank you. So apologies received from Councillor Riley with Councillor Gohill substituting.
Thank you very much. Are there any declarations of interest in matters coming before the meeting? No. The minutes of the previous meeting, which was the 23rd of November 2022. Are there any comments, additions, edits? Agreed? Thank you very much. Which brings us on to item 5, which is the budget planning report for services within the remit of the committee this evening. So, Ian, are you taking us through this? Sorry, no. Andy, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit about the process in terms of the Council setting its budget. So this is our second appearance at the Select Committees, with the first one being back in the summer. At this point, we've discussed the emerging issues facing the Council's budget pressures for the new financial year in the context of the 5-year budget strategy. Then in December, the Cabinet presented its set of budget proposals, presenting a balanced budget for 23-24. This Cabinet meeting then started the budget consultation process, with a consultation currently open for members of the public to complete online, and we also attend the Select Committees to consult with you on items and proposals that fall within the remit of this committee. The feedback from this committee will be included in the budget report, which will be presented to February Cabinet, where Cabinet will be asked to approve the budget proposals to full Council. So in terms of the report that's been presented to this committee, the headlines are for revenue, that we're basically experiencing a exceptional inflationary environment, which is both locally, nationally, and impacting on global economics, with inflation exceeding 10% back in September, and it's increased back since then in October, which is the highest level that we've seen since October 1981. So this is clearly having an impact on the Council's cost of service delivery, but also on the residents in terms of the cost of living crisis. Furthermore, the budget also includes COVID-19 legacy impacts and how they're impacting on Council services. Specific to the remit of this committee are exceptional inflationary demands impacting on energy, which are exceeding 90% forecast for 23-24, and vehicle fuel is expected to exceed 30%. To put that in the context of the Council's overall budget, back in February 2022, the savings requirement for 23-24 was expected to be £10 million. The numbers presented in the consultation budget at December Cabinet show that this has since doubled to over 20 million, with the Council's budget proposals including measures to bridge that gap and deliver a balanced budget. So within the remit of this committee, The savings being proposed are just under 1.2 million. So in the context of the budgets that fall within the range of this committee, we're also adding an additional 5.5 million to fund inflationary pressures, with 3.3 million of this relating to the energy uplift, and a further 4.6 million is being added through corporate items, with 3.6 million this relating to capital financing for the capital programme. So overall, we're looking at spending 58.2 million on services that fall within the remit of this committee next year, which is an 18% increase on the 22-23 budget. In terms of capital items that fall within the remit of this committee, we're looking at setting a budget of £46 million. So the main areas of spend of that are 28 million relating to the council's capitalisation of transformation spend, 4.4 million for the council's vehicle replacement programme, and 4 million on ICT. That was all I was going to take you through in terms of this report. So thank you, Chair, and I hope you're happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Andy, for your presentation. I just would like a little bit of clarity on point 17 here, which I'll just read it out quickly for anyone who doesn't have the papers in front of them. It says, it's clear that the government grants and business rates income will fail to match the prevailing levels of inflation. Could you just, I think it's important for the committee to know just how big that shortfall is. Would you care to expand on it?
Certainly. So when we review the council's financial position, we look at the funding available to the council and the cost of running the services. 75% of council service expenditure is funded from council tax and business rates, with business rates running on a national system of retention and redistribution across the country. The remaining 25% of the council's funding is mainly from government grants. So as we set out in the December Cabinet report, the provisional settlement wasn't published at that point, so it was our estimates of what that settlement was going to look like. That was published on the 20th of December and is roughly in line with what we presented at December Cabinet. But most of the grants aren't increasing in line with those uplifts, so it's not quite a straightforward question of the gap between the funding and the gap between the cost of the services, because most of our funding is from council tax. But when many of the grants aren't going up by inflation, then the gap between it's about 55 million, I think, of grant income, and so if that goes up by less than 10%, it's that element which is causing a further pressure on council services.
Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. The savings proposals of 45.5 million overall over the mid-term financial plan is a huge challenge. Within the corporate services, there's redesigns that are looking to particularly reach savings or cuts to the business performance team, as well as business support. I suppose in terms of savings, in order to maintain council services, if business performance teams and business support teams are cut or reduced, my concern would be then that either transformation won't be as successful, the council won't be able to deliver the services to the same quality, and if business transformation and service quality falls, that can have an impact in achieving the extremely ambitious savings targets. So I suppose my questions are around reassurances within the Cabinet's proposals about how much is also being invested into the staffing of reaching these savings, and not just the capital investment of things that we see through systems.
So in terms of the saving programme, the way the council approaches this isn't to just allocate out savings targets of various services. We do full in-depth reviews of the service areas before we put anything into the consultation budget. So we're fairly confident that we're able to deliver those. Yes, 20 million for year one is quite a substantial figure, and as you say, over the 5-year strategy, that's looking to grow to over 40 million. But we have done the detailed work on that, and of course when we look at that, we do look at what will be the knock-on impacts in service delivery, and we wouldn't put up a saving that we think was going to have an impact on the quality of the services to the residents. At this time, the savings programme basically looks at the areas that we've that fall within scope of the reviews. We still need to do the absolute detailed work on the review and how that's going to be delivered, but they're already fairly well worked up on how we would progress those reviews. But once those reviews take place, then that's when the reports will start to kind of feed through, and we'll do individual items and start to get further detail in them. But certainly no savings in here. Certainly within this committee, they're looking at the back office savings so we can protect those frontline services to residents.
Sorry. I just wonder whether you want to go over the capital investment plan a little bit and the fact that it requires £59 million of extra borrowing.
Yep, thank you, Chair. So the capital programme has been significantly reduced since over the last few years. So we've taken items out and we've looked at scaling back. We've also looked at how we fund items within the capital programme, try to maximise external funding sources such as grant schemes. So the programme that's within the the items within the capital programme now have been reviewed and made sure that they're fit for purpose for our residents, that they're delivering on manifesto issues and what the council feels it needs to deliver for the residents. So although the capital financing impact is quite significant within the remit of this portfolio, this committee, a lot of that is actually largely being driven by external forces at the moment, by interest rates going up. And there is a slight gain in terms of investments that we've made, and we also get the increased money from that. But at the moment, the higher interest rates are driving quite a significant movement on the borrowing requirement.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to paragraph 36 and subsequently paragraph 17 on fees and charges. On paragraph 36, last sentence says review fees and charges expected to generate just above £200,000. Do we have examples of the type of fees and charges that are under review at the moment?
So we're looking at the services. So it includes registrar's office. What else is in this committee?
We've got blue badges.
Blue badge income, and the contact centre charges, which is one that's specifically mentioned in this report. I think at the beginning there in paragraph 33. So contact centre charges, where we're charging on, that is the blue badge one, which is going up to the charge that we're allowed to raise under government guidelines.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. In the area of risk management, paragraphs 20 to 24, I see several of the strategies are based around the reserves. My question is, do we have any other mitigation that we can put into place to manage the risk? Building on the Chairman's question around capital investment plans, could we defer spending? How flexible is that? Because just dipping into our reserves doesn't give us many options. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So in terms of the Council's reserve, we hold general balances and earmarked reserves. So the budget strategy presented to December Cabinet includes no drawdown from general balances. So they are there to protect the Council against risks. In the February Cabinet presentation, when we come back next month, we'll include a detailed breakdown of how that the general balances minimum and maximum values are calculated for this borough. So at the moment they are set at minimum of 20 million going up to I think maximum 39, and that reviews the inflation environment, interest rate risk, demand risk, and just the kind of general financial standing of the council. The earmarked reserves are set aside for specific reasons. So we are using reserves within the budget presented to December Cabinet. So we're drawing down just over 5 million from earmarked reserves, with 1.5 of that relating to COVID legacy issues. In terms of other areas and how we manage the risk, the Council does detailed budget monitoring on a monthly basis, which also gets reported to Cabinet. So through that process, we also go through the risks, we review the saving, the delivery of that, and we're always looking for more opportunities to increase our funding and ways of reducing spend. So by doing that on a monthly basis, we've got good resilience in ways of reviewing the proposals that get presented to Cabinet and signed off, so that we get early indication where we need to take any remedial action. So we would normally try to target a management action to review, to cover off any pressures that emerge throughout the year before we look at using reserves. In terms of your second point on the capital programme, a lot of the council's investments also help to save money against the revenue. So, for example, we've got the schools programme, so we're looking to increase the amount of SEND provision within the borough, so we can then transport children more locally, which is also going to hopefully improve the quality of the service for the children involved, but then it has a knock-on effect of also reducing our revenue expenditure on transportation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I have some questions around financial management, just to get my mind around this budget. So, firstly, I think there's an IT efficiency here for the finance team. So it would be useful to get, if I've missed anything else around kind of how the finance team are contributing to savings. But the council made a significant surplus with during the COVID period with grants and but earmark that for the future. So it would be useful for me to get an understanding of how, in the longer term, in the midterm, how earmark reserves may be used in the future, because although they're being drawn down quite heavily this year, it doesn't show the kind of... everybody's concerned about local authority finance. It's not a political point, it's just it's difficult. And I think for the future proofing of the authority, earmark reserves are a useful mechanism. So it's how those can be built into future years, as it were. COVID legacy is an interesting one for me. It'd be useful to get an understanding of how the COVID is still having an impact on the authority's financial pressures, etc., because there isn't a lot of detail. So if you're able to just give a bit more understanding, kind of building on the kind of risk management of how earmark reserves can be used in the future, when does COVID's legacy end? Touch wood, hopefully soon, and just generally just around how the finances team is being efficient and effective, and if it's an area that needs investing or saving, in your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So most of the COVID legacy issues actually reside within social care, and they're related to where we had additional demand during the pandemic, and some of that demand may be kind of baked in now, and it's about supporting those people going forward. The main area of funding which has been impacted by COVID-19 has been the CTRS, Council Tax Reduction Scheme, where we saw an increase of 16% at the beginning of the pandemic. Since then, we've seen demand for that particular service unwind at approximately 3% per annum. So we're still seeing additional demand within the Council Tax Reduction Scheme as a result of COVID. We did have additional grant funding above and beyond our original pressures. So we were holding a small amount of earmarked reserves at the beginning of this year after we factored in our February 22 assumptions. We've now drawn down, I think we've got a closing balance of just under 2 million of grant funding left, with this December Cabinet position drawing down 1.5 million in 23-24, leaving just a small balance left going forward in COVID. In the main December Cabinet report, in Appendix 1, it does set out the Council's earmarked reserve strategy over the 5 years, with money being drawn down next year, and then after that it's fairly flat. Thank you.
Just a quick supplementary, if I may. On the Council Tax Reduction Scheme, there's in paragraph 35, there's savings from of 100k to review revenues and benefits. I just wanted assurances that that isn't a reduction to the generosity, it may not be the right word, of the Council Tax Reduction Scheme.
So there are two changes to the Council's Council Tax Reduction Scheme for next year. They're being presented at January Council as part of the tax base setting process. So the two changes are, we're increasing the charge for non-dependents living in the property. So the expectation is that those non-dependents should be able to contribute towards the council tax liability for that household. And the second change is to increase the minimum award from £1 to £2, and that's more to do with the administration of the scheme, where people's universal credit can go up and down, and they can dip in and out of qualifying. So there's a lot of administration around supporting. It's a very small number of clients, residents, it's under 50 households, but they just keep bouncing in and out, so there's a lot of admin work around that. So it's not really about changing the generosity of the scheme, but just making it simpler to administer. Thank you.
It's an aside comment, but under the COVID legacy, and it's nothing to do with this committee, but presumably there was a drop in social care, and it sounds terrible, but for our older people, some of who sadly died with increased excess deaths. So, does that balance in some way with the COVID legacy?
Thank you, Chair. So we did see an initial decline in particular older people's services at the beginning of the pandemic, but we saw an increase in mental health demand. So that's probably, I would say, that's outstripped the older people decline. Furthermore, there was avoidance of care homes, for example, so more people being provided support at home, which once they reach a certain level of need, then it can be more expensive to keep them at home. We also saw hospitals being overrun with demand, so there was additional pressure on the council to try and discharge people to free up hospital beds. So the government's actually given us additional funding going into 23-24 to further support hospital discharge, to work together as a kind of holistic health service to support the residents of the borough and look after the NHS and social care at the same time, which hopefully will be an improvement for residents as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Just quickly on paragraph 26, rather, under the budget proposals, there was you've mentioned in the report that we're expecting inflation to go up to 10% during 22-23 and 23-24 before returning to 4% over the remainder of the council's budget strategy. If that doesn't happen, could you go into a bit of detail about what kind of plans are in place to mitigate the impact if that doesn't happen? And hopefully inflation does come down, but in the instance where it doesn't, could you go into some detail, please?
Thank you, Councillor. So the council during outturn 21-22, so around about March 22 time going into April, we'd already started to see inflation going up. So the council took the decision to take some underspend in revenue and repurpose some earmarked reserves to create an inflation volatility earmarked reserve. So we've been reporting on that throughout the council's monthly budget monitoring, and we're obviously keeping a very close eye on that, and we've got our procurement colleague here today. So we worked with procurement, we work with the service areas, and through our monthly budget monitoring processes, we're very on top of what's happening and what's coming through in terms of negotiations, uplifts, and any other financial pressures driven by inflation. So we haven't fully utilised that inflation earmarked reserve, so going into 23-24, we will still have some money available there. And then on top of that, we have the other earmarked reserves. So as I said, the budget strategy in year one is drawing down reserves, but after that it's relatively flat. And then within the review of the general balances policy, we also review the inflation environment and review whether the amount within the minimum and maximum that we hold for general balances is suitable given the current economic circumstances. Thank you.
So I think we've given the subject a good airing, and the recommendation is that the committee notes the budget projections contained in the report and comments as appropriately on the combined budget proposals affecting the relevant services areas within the finance and corporate services cabinet portfolios within the context of the corporate budgetary position. Are we all agreed for those comments that we've made be registered. Great, thank you. Yes, I guess so. So are we happy for the chairman and the Labour lead to agree what those comments, or do we just agree those comments now? I guess we just agree those comments now. So, what are the comments? That we agree with the budget proposals and the saving. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd just like to say on the budget proposals, I think it's really important to understand the situation that we're going into over the next few years of this council term. Not just what we're going into, but also what we're carrying with us from the COVID legacy. I think this budget quite adequately sets out a plan, and I'm very confident in what Andy said about the budget plan to cover the council and make sure that we continue to put our residents first and continue to provide the high level services that we do. And I'm having read this budget and having read various reports into the finances of Hillingdon, I'm quite happy to support this.
Can we just turn that into a proposal and then
propose that? Sorry.
May I just a slight amendment around the committee, something around commenting on risk, and was aware that that there are risk things in place that need continuous monitoring. It's something quite bland, as it were, but just we have all mentioned kind of our concerns and risks because of the environment. So it'd be useful just to have something that said, the committee noted that there are risk management things in place and these will need to be continually monitored. I think it's just something that shows the situation needs, as it is getting constant attention.
Well, we do, as part of our processes, have risk management as central to all budgetary controls. So the committee notes the report and accepts that this is a balanced proposed budget that obviously has that the council will continue to monitor and maintain a risk register. Are we so are you proposing that?
Yes, I'd like to propose that, Chairman.
Are you seconding that? Thank you. We all agreed? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
You can stay or you can go, obviously. Okay, that brings us on to item 6, which brings us on to our major review of procurement, and we welcome Matthew to take us through this report.
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, for those of you who were here in the November session when I didn't attend, my apologies. There was an error in diaries, so my apologies for those who turned up and had no one to talk to them. So, first of all, obviously this is the second witness session. You've probably all had a chance, or hopefully you've had a chance to read this, so I'm going to give it, I will run through it and then I will open it up to questions. So, obviously in the first session in September, we went through with expert witness, we went through the legal and regulatory context and the procurement bill that continues to transit through Parliament, and we hope we will hear some further news on that soon. This is obviously the second session, of which is delivering how as a procurement function within the council we deliver value for money, and then there will be a subsequent session which will look at contract management. So broadly there's 3 areas that we just need to think about today. First is around pre-tender, so the strategic decision making that goes into determining what tender model it is, because we look at the pre-tender element as really the foundations of a tender, and it's really key that we get those right, so we'll look at those. Second is the actual tender process, more technical and transactional in terms of its application of the legal rules that we need to abide by, and specifically in there, because I know there's an appetite from committee to look at this, is around the social value and local supply market aspects. And then, although this trips into future elements, it's around the contract management and post-tender delivery, so making sure we've got, or we're getting, what we paid for and wanted. So just to kick that off, in terms of the pre-tender, the pre-tender phase, and what do I mean by the pre-tender phase? So that, for me, is all around understanding what the council needs. And I say needs rather than wants, because there's probably lots of wants nowadays, but we're really talking about needs, what the council needs, and how can the tender process be structured in a way that delivers the best mix of cost and quality. So how do we get the best outcomes for the money that we're spending as a council? So really that's what the pre-tender phase is, and that's what we're looking at and trying to decipher as we set about a tender process. Part of that really is trying to understand, well, when we get to the end of this process, what does success look like in terms of an outcome? So there's some of the questions we ask, and there's a lot of questions we've got to go. We're almost questioning ourselves as we go through this and understanding what is required. So I think, first of all, we need to understand the market. Does it provide what we actually need? There's no point in us trying to specify something that the market doesn't provide for. So I think if you look at an example, if we're looking for a new finance system, we've got to be mindful. We can't just say, oh, we want this, we want that, and we want the other, because that might not exist out in the market. We need to understand what the market is capable of offering, so then we can start to shape our requirement around what the market offers. What are others doing? So it's really important, not that we want to follow people, but equally we need to be careful we don't reinvent the wheel sometimes. So what are others doing? What are others around London doing? What are others in the private sector doing? Other authorities around the country. So that's a really important piece to understand who's doing it really well, who's not doing it well. Which bits can we merge into and dovetail into how we operate as a council. Really important at this stage we understand the cost drivers behind any project that we're getting into. So what are the factors that will drive those costs? Is it people? Is it machinery? Is it vehicles? Is it commodities such as fuel? So we need to understand those, because it allows us to shape our offer out to the market. And then I think we've also, just in listening to the finance positioning and where we are right now with the need to deliver savings, could the tender process that we're going to go through be part of a transformation process? Is there an ability to transform what we're doing in the council through the tender process? So when we've been through all that, as kind of a journey, and that can sometimes, depending on the value and the importance and the complexity of the tender, that can be a really quick process, and we say, well, actually what we've got is a really good way of doing it, or it can be a really complex tender, we need to do it in a different way, and that process can take 1, 2, 3 months. There's a journey to go on. But what we come out of that really with is, how do we package our requirements? How do we package our requirements to the market so that they're attractive to the market and elicit the right outcome for the council? And I've cited a kind of really quite a simple case here in the paper around, actually, do we want to consolidate our requirement? And I'm talking here about kitchens, windows, bathrooms, doors. Do we want to consolidate that requirement with one single provider? And that might be a kind of over multiple years, it might be a 20-30 million pound contract. Or do we want to go for a best in practice approach, and we say, well, actually we'll have a provider for kitchens, a provider for bathrooms, windows, doors, and each of those might be 2-3 million pounds each, or any hybrid of those, any mix that we might decide to have of those. So they're the sort of outcomes that we want from this pre-tender process, because it enables us really to start addressing that. And the key element of this is starts us to allow us to build a specification of our requirements that the suppliers and the market can submit commercial proposals against. And that would, of course, in this instance be service-led. So it's up to the service that we work with to define their requirements in a way that the market will understand. And obviously, as part of a central service function. We support and facilitate that process. I think one of the other things, and we won't get into it in too much detail today, but throughout this pre-tender phase, it's also really key to start looking at the contract management. How are we going to ensure that in 6 months, 7, 8 months' time, when this contract is in place, we're getting what we paid for, and we can enforce the deliverables of that contract. So now is the time at that pre-tender phase to develop the contract management framework, to look at actually what are the tools we're going to use to drive the performance. So that's the pre-tender phase, which is then, once complete and we're happy with what we've got, we're happy with our approach, our route to market, we look at the tender. So as I say, it's a more transactional but no less important. Due to the regs, it comes with plenty of risk if we don't do it correctly. And for me, the tender process is about execution of the strategy. So we've said what we want to do. Now we're going to go and deliver it. So what we're essentially doing in the tender process is our supply selection. We're deciding which supply we want to work with. And so through the tender process, we're assessing the supplier's ability to meet our requirements. So that'll be a whole range of things. That'll be insurance, that'll be financials, health and safety, capability. I will assess that through request for them to give us method statements. Their capacity. Have they got the capacity to deliver what we're looking for? And obviously a key element of this is their response to our commercial offer. So actually, how much are you going to charge us to deliver the service that we have set out? Generally, the process we go through is a mix of 50-50 price quality, and certainly that's what's in standing orders, but we do retain a right to, or an opportunity to flex that as needed. So certainly on more transactional services, we would go 80-20 price, so 80% price, 20% quality. On other services where there's an intellectual capital aspect of it, we might go 20% quality, 20% price, 80% quality. So you start to get the idea, somewhere between those two, but our general position is 50-50. There's a slight leaning towards 60 quality and social care, whereas in facilities and housing and constructions, we leave more 60% to price. So we listen to the market. We need to understand what the requirements are. So that is that element. So just moving on then. So two key aspects within the tender process. First, social value and the environmental. It's becoming an increasingly important component of public sector tendering, and we understand that. I think it's fair to say there's no hard and fast rule within Hillingdon. We don't have a set system. We try to retain that flexibility, but generally we're maxing out at 10% of the total marks on offer for social care. So that'd be the maximum we would offer in terms of the social value and the environmental type questions. And you can see some of those questions that we are asking in the report. Primarily, I think it's fair to say, related to environmental, but as you just turn the page there onto page 16, you can see questions relating to indicate your proposals on recruiting locally and providing apprenticeship opportunities and how many. So we're asking those sorts of questions, what people can deliver us for us. I think other boroughs will use far more technical methods of assessing social value. So there's a whole industry that's sprung up about social value calculators that people use, and they essentially attribute value to different elements. So, for example, if we had a consultancy contract and we wanted social value, someone might say, well, we can send an engineer into a sixth form classroom for half a day, and they'll talk to your sixth form students and inspire them and take them through some engineering, interesting engineering educational points. And so from a social value perspective, the input cost to that will be for the supplier might be £300-400 of that engineer's time. But actually the social value, some of the calculators would say, well, we shouldn't look at the input, we should look at the outputs. What do the outputs? That is essentially what the calculator would give you. We haven't been down that route. I think it's fair to say that we're in the early stages of our journey on social value, and we're trying to keep it quite broad, which you can see from the questions that we ask. And part of the reason I've tried to set out there in a scenario within the paper, and this idea of this supplier A and supplier B. So you've got two providers who essentially get quality score of 40%. Supplier A gets the best price score. So essentially they're charging us £100,000. Supplier B charges £110,000, but only gets 35%. Because the supplier with the lower social value is also the lower cost, but not sufficiently, we actually end up awarding to a more expensive contractor in this scenario that I've set out here. And there lies one of the challenges for us in this, because we're under pressure to ensure we're delivering value for money on all occasions, and there could be a discussion around here. Well, actually, where does the value, the financial value, as opposed to that social value, and attributing that social value to financials? But in the scenario that I have set out, we would be going with a supplier that is going to cost £10,000 more, and I think that's something that just needs to be given some thought in terms of how we want to apply social value. So it's also, we don't have a corporate policy on social value, so it's really difficult for us as a procurement team to hang our hat on something and say, well, this is what we want, this is what we need to do. And I think my final point on that really is, if we're asking in a tender process for elements of social value, there needs to be a lot of contract management to make sure it's being delivered. So there's a kind of a further cost to that. The contract management needs to not just be on performance, but it needs to be on performance of their social value, because if it impacts on the outcome of the tender process, we need to make sure we're receiving those outcomes. That's the social value. Next up is the local supply market, and obviously we have been through this at previous committees, but the local supply market is closely linked to social value, but has kind of elements around levelling up, net carbon zero, job creation, skills and training, and it's really those aspects that we tried to pull out. So there are a number of challenges that we need to just consider. So makeup of local businesses is not guaranteed to be able to deliver what we require, either in terms of capacity, capability. So it doesn't always work where we say we want a local supplier. I think it's worth saying that not all suppliers want to work with a local authority. Sometimes they might have a really full order book anyway. So, and sometimes it doesn't align with our procurement strategy. So if we package our works in a particular way, it might make it less attractive for some of those small local providers. And I think also the definition of what is a local provider is absolutely key. And a local provider could be someone who is based in the borough, but equally there'll be people operating around the borough that we might be interested in working with. And they might have a registered office in Hillingdon, but they might not be based here. They might be based here, but their accountants is out of the borough. So lots of different permutations around what is a local business. We have done a lot in the last 12 months to try and start that engagement. So we've updated our tender documents, and my team are always actively trying to identify local suppliers to work with. And there are further pieces of work under consideration to enhance that engagement with the local supply bases. So new web pages, so an expression of interest form. How do we actually learn about these suppliers that are out there? The way in which the council packages its requirements. So generally, if we've got small businesses, we would have to go to smaller packages of work to make it more viable for them. That creates a challenge on the back end in terms of contract management, and in terms of value for money, and in terms of internal administrative costs. But there is kind of potential for bespoke support for high potential local organisations in terms of if they're showing a willingness to work with us and we think they've got the capacity, think they've got the capability, it's something that we could look at in terms of how we work with smaller suppliers. Obviously has to be within the rules and the regulations. So I think, sorry, that was meant to be a quick run through. I'm happy to open up to questions now. I'm sure there's quite a few.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the report, Matthew. It's very useful. I think it's a relatively strong consideration in your report on supporting local businesses and selecting them. I'm quite interested to see how you kind of actively seek out local suppliers and the process you take to do that. I'm quite concerned that sometimes companies help, especially larger corporates, draft bid tenders. For example, the questioning you've got is kind of very easily open to kind of abuse. So it does put smaller local businesses at sort of a disadvantage, and also doesn't give you the ability to truly assess the nature of a tender. I'm wondering if you're able to spot that at all, if it's been drafted by bid writers, and what support, if any, can be provided to small businesses once they're in the tendering process. I understand that there's sort of a balance on taking into account your concerns about the capacity of smaller local businesses and also supporting them. And my suggestion is that perhaps it would be more cost effective for the council sometimes to have a small business run sort of the key operations on a particular project, and then have the council sort of internally supporting. Or I like the idea of sort of the consolidating requirements, where smaller businesses work collaboratively with larger ones on a specific project. And I'm wondering if we can impose subcontracting as a contractual requirement as part of the larger tender process. And that will, of course, give opportunities to smaller businesses and understand how bigger businesses normally apply for tenders.
You give me loads of questions there, so you might need to give me a prompt on some of them. So the first piece, yes, in terms of bid teams, it's like night and day in terms of seeing how some of the bigger corporates submit tenders. That's what they do. They're experts at it. They've got full teams in place, and it's I guess as part of that pre-tender piece, when we understand what our focus is, what we're trying to deliver, then we can start to shape some of those questions. And there are instances where we know we want to work with smaller local providers, and we know smaller local providers are stronger. So we try and shape the questions to them in those instances. I think if we're talking about kind of really small operations, kind of almost 10, 15, maybe 20 people, and it depends on the type of firm, doesn't it? But they're never going to be able to write bids themselves at the same level as one of those big corporates are. And we try our best in terms of writing the questions to get that right. There is a plethora of support out there for smaller businesses from independent bid writers. But ultimately, we've got to, as a public body, we've got to be able to get that assurance, and it's through the questioning that they can deliver across governance aspects and also operational aspects of the tender. Can they actually deliver what we need here? So the way in which we do that is through that questioning approach. And so, in a way, there is an inbuilt disadvantage to some of those bigger suppliers, to some of those smaller suppliers on the face of it. They are, though, also they have got advantages. You know, they don't have a bid team, so in some ways that becomes reflective in the commercial proposal they can put across. And sometimes they can be far more reactive and responsive and adaptive to our requirements. I think the challenge is that they get that we allow them the opportunity to build that into the response to their questions.
You spoke of this as a single phase tendering process. Do we run multi-phase tender processes?
Yes, so we do. I have simplified it in a way, but we do. We run. So when I've spoken about this, I've done it in kind of what would be an open tender process, where we take everyone, it just funnels first time. But there can be a restricted tender process where we do almost a pre-sift and bring it down from everyone to kind of 5, 6, 7, 8 providers who we then invite to tender. So yes, there are different approaches. We can establish framework contracts. We can do what I call DPS, dynamic procurement systems, where everyone is allowed to participate if they clear a certain hurdle. So there's lots of different methods of operation, and picking the correct tender process and tender route would be part of that pre-tender strategy.
Okay, I run an engineering group, and what we do is we do user requirement specifications, and they can be in multi-phases, so you can have one tender process for each phase, and they're sequential. So the URS is a incredibly important document, because then you're setting out your goals and your milestones within it, and then you measure when you get to the end, near to the end of one phase, then you go into the next tendering process for the next phase, and they don't necessarily go to the same companies. But I don't know whether we do projects that are as large as that.
We do some fairly large projects. I'm not sure we do it in that way, though.
Right.
I mean, we'd retain flexibility in situations to move away from contractors, and I think an important part of how we structure it is how we retain a competitive pressure throughout the life of a contract. You know, contractors get lazy when they've had a work awarded, so it's really important that we understand, whether through a contract management approach or through an ongoing competitive scenario, how we kind of keep them keen throughout the process. Sometimes, you know, we can do that through ongoing competitions, so we only award small lots of work. So I know I've spoken about kitchens and bathrooms here. We award that in fairly small chunks. So every time they've got to perform. They're only as good as their last job, and if they don't keep performing, they might be less likely to get the work. But I probably not in the exact way that you describe.
Thank you, Chairman. Matthew, thank you for a very comprehensive report. I found that very interesting. Just to pick up on the point around the local supply market, is there anything in terms of, like, how do I phrase this, a reverse process that we do on smaller suppliers to make sure that they will be like a going concern going forward? And just, you know, thinking back to my audit days, there's no sort of reputational risk of the council dealing with some of these smaller providers who may have, I'm just making this up, operations in, you know, countries with conflicts and things like that. So it's almost like we do a check on them. I know we're looking at governance and operational things, but to make sure, you know, they are going to be around in 18 months if it's like a 24-month contract. And what I said about, you know, do we want to be dealing with these people? Because on smaller businesses, it's difficult maybe to get this information or find this information. Thank you.
I think it's a good question, and it's really difficult to answer. I think we'd take every instance on a case-by-case basis. You're right, there's issues of transparency, but I guess those issues of transparency exist in some ways with larger organisations as well. I think we need to be careful, especially the financials, especially at this time. We go through a process. We use Dun & Bradstreet reports to make sure we're doing our due diligence, and then obviously depending on the rating, we would ask for more detail for those that look more of a concern, or where the risk of failure is higher. We would finance colleagues would then do their own interpretation of the reports of those organisations. I'm not sure I've got a kind of straightforward answer. I think we've got to do our due diligence on all of them, and hence the reason when we do a tender and people say, oh, here's this kind of 20, 30 pages from the council, that's part of the reason they might not want to deal with us, is we've got to ask some of those questions to do our due diligence. And the procurement regulations, as they're currently structured, allow an element of self-cleansing. So we ask a lot of questions of suppliers that they say yes or no to, and it's at the end of that process then we can validate and do our due diligence on the suppliers.
Thank you. And just a follow-up. So if, just again, looking at some of these paragraphs, a business of 10 or less employees, they are struggling, just again, cold flu season, half the team's out. Are there any mitigations we have in place to make sure that they can deliver, or like a plan B, or do we just see what happens and then deal with it when it comes that?
Yeah, okay, I understand. So as part of our tender process, we would be asking questions on capability and capacity for them to deliver. So what happens in the scenario of X? So you're absolutely right. If you've got a small, if you engage with a small business, potentially an owner-led business, and they decide as you say, they fall ill with the flu or COVID, we've got a challenge. So it's part of the tender and making sure we're assessing the supplier. We've got to ask those questions, and that relates to the risk that is in individual procurements. It will be higher in some than in others.
Councillor Mathers, can I just add one bit into that? I take it you will only take a certain percentage of a company's turnover.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's not set. But we would certainly. It is. In fact, sorry, it is in our rules, but I can't remember the exact level. But it's part of our financial due diligence that we do. 25%.
We wouldn't take more than 25% of the companies.
Yeah. It's broadly around that.
Thank you, Chair. A little alarmed at the number of barriers there are for and the disadvantage to small businesses. And I think maybe it would be useful to have some more thought on how we enable more, just beyond kind of checking out the general market. One of the things we discussed at the last meeting was around using procurement in that pre-tender stage to help improve some of the working practices. So, for example, London Living Wage was mentioned. We know that we've got a council have agreed where practically possible to ensure that suppliers and procured services are net carbon zero by 2035. So I guess we still have a journey to go in enabling those social value aspects. But I suppose my question is, how is that being mapped out to improve procurement in the future around social value, around a more barrier-free, but obviously risk-assessed local market? I know, for example, a number of suppliers struggle with lot size. If we think about care at home places, having 2 lots, north and south of the borough, is a huge area, which means smaller, very high quality, good value care at home providers are just unable to compete because of the volume of the contract.
Yeah.
And that's probably made from an administrative point of view, but the cost to local quality of service to residents, putting them first, and the cost to enabling and encouraging, particularly in a sector that is demanding a good, healthy competition at a more micro level, gets a little lost. So I guess where are we in that creating that social value and local business policy?
So I think you're right. I think there's a point there around getting the balance right and making sure we don't kind of go one way or the other, because not only is there a social value aspect to it, there's a commercial aspect to it, and if you do too much with one organisation, the balance of power starts to move to that single organisation. So home care is a really good example, and you cite there 2 main providers, but actually our strategy surrounding that is not just 2 main providers, it's 70% to 2 main providers, and then below that, the remaining 30% of that work, we've got a framework that sits across another 10 providers in adults and 5 or 6 in children's. So what we've tried to do there is get the balance right between the kind of administrative and operational efficiency and the benefits of having a smaller number of providers and providing COVID grants to 40, 50, 60 home care providers is massively resource intensive, so hugely challenging, hugely costly to the council, versus the benefits of having a far smaller number of providers that we can work more closely with. So I think it is that balance, and I think, once again, back to that pre-tender phase, the outcome of that is that actually we've got some more of those local suppliers working with us, and some of the lead providers are based locally. They have offices locally in the borough, so they are locally based, and that's, for me, that's part of the challenge. They are local, and we want to harness that, but equally we've got to just balance it with what is available and what is viable for us to deliver. So, and I think that's one example. I think what we want to try and do is take similar every time we've got a model and we're looking at how we deliver it, what is right. So, for example, I'm having a meeting tomorrow on, and the reason I keep mentioning it is windows, bathrooms, kitchens and doors, and in terms of how we start to deliver that. There's some really huge providers in the market, the mayors and the such like, who are delivering these contracts for lots of housing associations, lots of councils, but actually I'm not sure it's right for Hillingdon as a council. And what we want to try and do is work out how we work with smaller second tier, third tier contractors to deliver the same outcomes, but hopefully at a lower cost, but one that is administratively possible to deliver.
Thank you, Jay. Just following up on your objective of having sort of the second tier, third tier sort of local suppliers. I'm just wondering what steps you're taking to kind of advertise these tenders, and I'm wondering if we're sort of actively engaged with local chambers of commerce or sort of local networking groups like BNI, which I'm a member of myself, and there's a few other really good local networking groups. I'm wondering if we've, to what extent we've done that kind of outreach.
We haven't done any kind of particularly recently, but I have been involved in some of them, certainly with High Speed 2 in the borough, Heathrow. There has been kind of conferences that we've attended and I've spoken at around opportunity for second tier providers. It's potentially something we could pick up again in more detail. There's a piece of me that says, well, we want to avoid really long supply chains with lead contractors who then sub everything. I'm not sure we've had the best experience as a council of working with lead contractors with lots of subbing below it, and hence my response just earlier on bathrooms, windows, kitchens and doors, all that housing repairs and housing planned works. Sometimes we can go direct to providers, and it's about finding what is the right balance from those. But certainly there's instances where we can't, when we're doing major, if you look at the Hayes regen, you've got to go with a lead provider, and in that instance there was a large social value element around the working with local communities. So once again, right, all these questions apply really well to some instances and less to others, and I think part of this is about me and my procurement team pushing this back to service areas to make sure they're considering it as part of their how are we going to deliver this? How does it not just deliver an operational outcome, but how does it tick some of those other boxes that we need to try and do to be the kind of modern, forward-thinking council?
Matthew, excuse me. Question on: does the council have a preferred bidder register or a database of companies that we use regularly in terms of our preferred bidding process? And if so, is that a hindrance to new businesses or new companies trying to get onto that preferred bidder register?
So we don't have a preferred bidder is probably not a term we use. So we've got a requirement to tender all our requirements, certainly above a standing order requirement to tender everything, I think, above £10,000, and a public contract reg above £25,000 to advertise it. So within that, though, there are opportunities for us to use external frameworks. So where frameworks exist, they might have 4, 5, 6 providers on. It allows us to do, some frameworks allow us to do a direct call-off, a direct award to a particular supplier, or do what's called a mini competition. Equally, we can build our own frameworks and have probably the closest thing to your preferred bidder list. where we'd say we want to have X number of contractors, or a good example is we're just building a framework for consultants, building services consultants, and we might have circa 5 or 6 M&E consultants on there, 5 or 6 architects, 5 or 6 employees, agents. I don't think in those scenarios it naturally, sorry, let me rephrase that. It naturally restricts the market, but I think there's a benefit there to Hillingdon of doing that. We start to work with some of those contracts. It's still been through a competitive process to secure the best rates. The other piece, and we do this on home to school passenger transport, is we have what's called a DPS, and providers can join at any point throughout that. There's well, not any point. We can restrict it just for admin purposes, but they can join throughout that process as long as they clear a certain hurdle. So then, when there's new requirements, they can participate in that tender process.
Thank you, Chair. May I just go back to ask some detail on part of my last question? It would be useful to know the pathway or the design process for the carbon zero by 2035. So how that is starting to be thought about in terms of the pre-tender process and the tender process. I know you have questions.
Yes.
But in order to become net zero through the supply chain, there needs to be a plan of how much carbon emission. I know we have specialists in the council in other spaces, but it'd be useful to get at least the initial thinking around how that's being built into tenders.
Okay, so I guess you've seen some of the questions we asked within here. So that would be the main piece within the remit of procurement. I think we're always keen to, the actual requirement to do for the carbon neutral commitment, I think, and how we go about that needs to be driven through the specification process. And I think it's fair to say from a specifying perspective, we probably need to do more work on that. I think we're only just starting to get going and understand the size of the challenge.
Thank you, Chairman. So Matthew, I was really pleased to see that social value is increasingly important component of the tender process. One question I had on page 16, on looking at the example, a third of the way down. When we award a contract, maybe on the social value score, is there an indirect cost of monitoring that social value? So looking at the examples before, disposing of waste, and I think you mentioned internships. So is there like an indirect cost of somebody actually going to see if that waste was disposed of, properly? Were the internships actually delivered? And what I'm trying to get to is that something that was a direct cost of 110 ends up being like a cost of 120 because of indirect governance. Does that make sense? So we've got to see if they actually do deliver what they promised in the original contract.
Yeah, and you're right. There's got to be an investment in contract management to make sure that those things are done. How closely you do depends on for example, someone going into a school to provide a lecture or some experience to students. You would just generally get a report to say these things have been done. But there is an element that says you've got to contract management because you're paying for it. You're paying for it in your bid, and they're saying they're going to do it. But you'd contract manage it in the same way that someone says, actually, I'm going to go and cut the grass 6 times a year. Well, I'm going to go out and check you've cut the grass 6 times a year when you tell me you've done it. So part of that will be about self-reporting. There's always an element of self-reporting because we just haven't got the resource to micromanage contractors. But you're absolutely right. There's a cost attached to ensuring that contracts are being delivered. So whether that's on an operational aspect or whether that's a social value aspect, we've got to make sure we're kind of managing it. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good, Aaron.
Very good.
So the recommendation is that the committee noted and comment on the information presented.
Super. Thank you. Thank you all.
I believe so. We have witness session 3 at the next meeting.
That's correct, yes. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Never quite sure whether this actually works as an agenda item, because everybody just sits there and just nodding. But are there any items that anybody's fascinated to hear more about? Nope. Okay. So we've noted the forward plan, and that's probably all we have to do, isn't it? Agenda item 8, which is the work programme for the committee. So the date of the next meeting is the 8th of February. At that time, I believe we'll have the third witness session for this review. Are you with us then? Or? That'll be Nikki. Okay. So, has anybody got any comments about any of the programme? You do. Excellent.
Thank you. I note that I know we had previous discussions about having a witness from the Chamber of Commerce come down. I was wondering, I can see here there's some external witnesses. I was wondering if that's confirmed and who it may be.
I'm unsure yet, but I can advise the committee once we have confirmation.
Thank you, Chair. We do have the final witness session, but we don't have any kind of information items or one-off items over the next 2 months. And we previously suggested digitalisation and human resources. I think it would be useful to get an understanding of particularly human resources. But could I also add customer service? I know we get complaint monitoring at least once a year, but it would be useful, I think, to understand a little bit more about the internal monitoring or the internal performance of customer services, particularly phone lines, in order to, as many of us will get residents come to us about this, and we do want to support residents to digitalise, but I wonder if it could be looked at as an information item, as something to brief the committee on, in order to raise reflections with the customer service, particularly call centre based teams.
Thank you. Democratic Services can liaise with officers to see what information is available, and we will update you and add it to the work programme if it's possible.
An interesting item might also be to look at a review of members' inquiries, the new members' inquiries after about 6 months, just to see how it's all working. We agree?